The rain came out of nowhere, a sudden, violent downpour that turned the city's late afternoon glow into a blur of headlights and shimmering puddles. Mark Evans had just finished his shift at the construction site, his boots caked with mud, his mind already drifting to the evening ahead. Homework with his daughter, maybe a movie if she finished her spelling words. He was halfway across the parking lot, umbrella forgotten in the back seat of his battered pickup, when he saw her. Julia Hartman, his boss, the woman who ran the entire project with a kind of cool, relentless efficiency that made grown men scramble to impress her. She was standing under the narrow awning by the office trailer, clutching her phone, her hair already plastered to her cheeks. She looked so out of place, her tailored suit jacket soaked, her heels sinking into the gravel, her expression caught somewhere between frustration and disbelief. Mark hesitated. He'd never spoken to her outside of meetings, never dared to do more than nod politely when she passed by. She was the kind of woman who seemed untouchable, always in control, always a step ahead. But now, in the storm, she looked human, vulnerable even. He jogged over, rain pelting his shoulders, and stopped a few feet away. "Miss Hartman?" he called, raising his voice over the roar of the rain. "You need a ride?" She looked up, startled, as if she hadn't noticed him approach. For a moment she just stared, her blue eyes wide and uncertain. Then she nodded, almost imperceptibly. "My car service canceled," she said, her voice tight, "and I can't get a signal." Mark gestured to his truck. "It's not fancy, but it's dry. I can get you wherever you need to go." Julia hesitated, glancing at the truck, then back at the empty street. The rain was coming down harder now, thunder rumbling in the distance. She nodded again, more decisively this time. "Thank you, Mark." He led her across the lot, shielding her as best he could with his body. By the time they reached the truck, both were soaked through. Mark fumbled with the keys, cursing under his breath when they slipped from his wet fingers. Julia surprised him by laughing, a short, breathless sound that seemed to catch her off guard as much as him. "Sorry," he muttered, finally unlocking the door. "It's seen better days." She slid into the passenger seat, shivering. "So have I." Mark started the engine, the heater sputtering to life. For a moment they just sat there, the storm drumming on the roof, the windows fogging up with their breath. Mark glanced at her, unsure what to say. He'd never seen her like this, her hair a mess, her makeup smudged, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to wring the water from her sleeves. "Where to?" he asked finally. She hesitated, glancing at her phone again. "I was supposed to meet someone for dinner. Midtown, but—" She trailed off, staring out at the rain. "Honestly, I just want to go home." Mark nodded. "No problem. Just tell me where." She rattled off an address in a part of town Mark had only driven through, never stopped. He pulled out of the lot, wipers squealing against the glass, the city lights smeared and distorted by the rain. For a while, they drove in silence, the only sound the hum of the engine and the storm outside. Mark risked a glance at her. She was staring out the window, her jaw clenched, her hands twisting in her lap. He wondered what it was like, being her, always in charge, always expected to have the answers. He thought of his own life, the constant balancing act of work and fatherhood, the way every day felt like a test he was barely passing. He cleared his throat. "You okay?" She blinked, as if startled by the question. "I'm fine," she said automatically. Then, softer, "Just not how I pictured my day ending." Mark smiled, just a little. "Yeah, life's good at throwing curveballs." She glanced to him, something shifting in her expression. "You have kids, right?" He nodded. "One, Sophie. She's 8, smart as a whip, stubborn as her old man." Julia smiled, the tension in her shoulders easing a fraction. "I remember seeing her at the company picnic. She beat everyone at the sack race." Mark laughed, surprised she remembered. "Yeah, she's competitive. Gets it from her mom." Julia's smile faded, her gaze dropping to her hands. "You're a single dad, aren't you?" Mark nodded, the familiar ache settling in his chest. "Yeah, been just us for a while now." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "That must be hard." He shrugged. "Some days, but she's worth it." They fell into silence again, but it felt different now, less awkward, more comfortable. The city rolled by outside, neon signs flickering in the rain, people huddled under awnings and bus shelters. Mark found himself wanting to fill the silence, to keep her talking. "Can I ask you something?" he said, glancing at her. She looked at him, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Sure." "Why construction? I mean, you could probably do anything. Why this?" Julia was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the fogged-up window. "My dad was a builder," she said finally. "He used to take me to job sites when I was a kid. I loved watching things come together, seeing something go from nothing to something real. I guess I wanted to build things too." Mark nodded, understanding more than she knew. Makes sense. They drove on, the storm easing as they crossed the bridge into her neighborhood. Julia seemed to relax, her posture softening, her voice less guarded. She asked about Sophie, about how Mark managed work and parenting, about the little things that made up his days. Mark found himself opening up, telling her stories he'd never shared with anyone at work. The times Sophie tried to bake him a birthday cake and set the oven on fire. The nights he stayed up late helping her with science projects. The quiet moments when he wondered if he was doing enough. By the time they pulled up in front of her building, the rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle. Julia turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Mark," she said quietly, "for the ride and for everything." He shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "Anytime." She hesitated, then reached out, her hand resting on his arm. "Really, I mean it." Mark met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. For a moment, the world outside faded away, the storm, the city, the endless demands of their lives. It was just the two of them suspended in the quiet aftermath of the rain. Julia stepped out of the truck, the drizzle cool against her skin, but she didn't move toward the building right away. She stood there, one hand on the door, looking back at Mark through the open window. The streetlights caught the raindrops on his lashes, and for a second she forgot who she was supposed to be, the boss, the woman who never let anyone see her shaken. "You sure you're okay getting upstairs?" he asked, voice low, almost careful. She almost laughed. "I think I can manage an elevator, Mark." He smiled, that small, crooked smile that made him look younger than his 35 years. "Just checking." Julia hesitated. Something in her chest felt tight, unfamiliar. Gratitude, yes, but something else too. Something that made her want to keep him there a little longer. "Tomorrow," she said suddenly, "come to the office an hour early. I owe your breakfast. Least I can do after you played knight in muddy armor." Mark's eyebrows lifted. "You don't owe me anything." "I want to," she said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. "Please." He studied her for a beat, then nodded. "All right. See you tomorrow, Miss Hartman." "Julia," she corrected softly. "Julia," he repeated, and the way he said it, like he was tasting the word, sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the rain. She watched him drive away, taillights disappearing around the corner before she finally walked inside. In the elevator up to her penthouse, she caught her reflection in the mirrored walls, hair a disaster, mascara streaked, suit ruined, and started laughing. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed at herself. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat on her couch with a glass of wine she barely touched, staring at the city lights, replaying every moment in that truck. The way he'd angled his body to shield her from the rain, the quiet steadiness in his voice when he talked about Sophie, the way he'd looked at her, not with pity, not with awe, just recognition, like he saw her. She told herself it was nothing, just gratitude, just adrenaline from the storm, but she knew better. The next morning, Mark arrived at the office at 6:30 sharp, still in his work boots and a clean flannel shirt, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Julia was waiting with 2 coffees and a paper bag from the bakery down the street. "Figured you'd like blueberry," she said, handing him a muffin. He took it, surprised. "How'd you—" "I pay attention," she said simply. They sat in the empty conference room, the city still quiet outside the windows. For a while, they ate in silence, the kind that wasn't awkward. Then Julia spoke. "I owe you more than breakfast," she said. "Last night, I don't usually let people see me like that." Mark looked at her, steady. "I didn't see anything you didn't want me to." She swallowed. "Still, thank you." He nodded, then asked, You always work this hard to thank people who give you a ride in the rain? A smile tugged at her lips. Only the ones who don't make me feel stupid for needing it. They talked for nearly an hour about work, about Sophie's upcoming school play, about how Julia hadn't taken a real vacation in 3 years. When the first employees started trickling in, Julia realized she didn't want the conversation to end. "Walk with me to the site later," she asked. "I want to check the east wing framing." Mark agreed, and something shifted between them, small, almost invisible, but real. Over the next 2 weeks, it became a quiet routine. Coffee in the mornings, walks to the site, conversations that grew longer, deeper. Julia learned that Mark had lost his wife to cancer 4 years ago, that he still kept her favorite coffee mug in the cupboard because Sophie liked to drink cocoa from it, that he'd turned down promotions because they required travel and he refused to miss bedtime stories. Mark learned that Julia's father had died when she was 19, that she'd built the company from a tiny firm into a powerhouse to prove she could, that she hadn't had a serious relationship in 6 years because she didn't trust anyone not to leave, that sometimes, late at night, she still cried in the shower where no one could hear. They never labeled it, they never crossed a line, but everyone noticed. The way Julia's voice softened when she said Mark's name, the way he lingered after meetings just to ask if she'd eaten. Then came the day everything changed. It was a Friday, late afternoon. The site was buzzing with inspections. Julia was in the trailer reviewing plans when her assistant rushed in, pale. "Julia, there's been an accident. East wing, partial collapse. Mark, he was up there." The world tilted. Julia dropped everything and ran. She found him sitting on the back of an ambulance, shirt torn, blood on his temple, but alive, breathing, talking to the paramedic like it was nothing. "Mark!" She dropped to her knees in front of him, hands shaking as she touched his face. "Are you hurt? What happened?" "I'm fine," he said, voice rough. "Beam gave way. I pushed 2 guys out of the way, got clipped, that's all." She stared at him, tears she didn't know she was holding spilling over. "You could have died." "But I didn't," he said softly, reaching up to brush a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Hey, I'm okay." Julia couldn't speak. She just leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, breathing him in, sawdust and rain and something that felt like home. The paramedics gave them space. Around them, the site had gone quiet. Later, after the hospital cleared him, just a mild concussion and some bruises, Julia drove him home. Sophie was with his sister for the weekend. The house was Stork when they arrived. Inside, Julia helped him to the couch, her hands still trembling. Mark caught her wrist gently. "Julia, look at me." She did, tears still falling. "I'm okay," he said again. "I promise." She shook her head. "I was so scared." "I know. I can't." Her voice broke. "I can't lose you." The words hung between them, raw and terrifying. Mark pulled her down beside him, wrapping his arms around her. She buried her face in his neck, breathing him in, letting herself fall apart in a way she never had before. He held her like she was the most precious thing in the world. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were red but steady. "I love you," she whispered. "I didn't mean for it to happen, but I do. I love you, Mark." He stared at her, stunned, then cupped her face with both hands. "I've been in love with you for weeks," he said, voice rough with emotion. "I just didn't think you'd ever look at me twice." Julia laughed through her tears. "Are you kidding? You saved my life that night in the rain. You've been saving me every day since." He kissed her then, slow, deep, like he'd been holding it back for months. She kissed him back like she was drowning and he was air. Outside, the storm had passed. Inside, something new was beginning. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, painting golden stripes across the floor. Julia woke first, curled on Mark's couch, his arm draped protectively around her. For a moment, she just watched him sleep, his face softer, younger, the lines of worry smoothed away. She traced the scar on his jaw with her eyes, remembering how close she'd come to losing him, how quickly everything could change. She slipped out of his embrace and padded quietly to the kitchen, searching for coffee. The house was lived in, cluttered with Sophie's drawings on the fridge, a stack of library books on the table, a pair of tiny sneakers by the door. Julia smiled, feeling a pang of longing for something she never let herself want: a home, a family, a place to belong. She was pouring coffee when Mark appeared in the doorway, hair tousled, eyes still heavy with sleep. He watched her for a moment, then crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her from behind, pressing his lips to her shoulder. "Morning," he murmured. "Morning," she replied, leaning into him. They stood like that for a while, the quiet broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of birds outside. Julia closed her eyes, letting herself believe, just for a moment, that this could be real. Mark finally spoke, his voice hesitant. "You sure about this?" She turned in his arms, searching his face. "I've never been more sure of anything." He smiled, relief sledding his features. "Good, because I don't want to go back to pretending." "Me neither." They ate breakfast together, sharing stories and laughter, the awkwardness of new love softened by the comfort of old friendship. Julia told him about her childhood, about the summers she spent helping her father build tree houses and fix leaky roofs. Mark told her about the first time Sophie rode a bike without training wheels, how she'd crashed into a bush and come up laughing, fearless. Later, Sophie came home, bursting through the door with a backpack full of art projects and a head full of questions. She stopped short when she saw Julia in the kitchen, her eyes wide with surprise. "Miss Hartman?" she asked, uncertain. Julia knelt down, smiling. "Hi, Sophie. I hope it's okay I'm here." Sophie looked at her dad, then back at Julia. "Did you sleep over?" Mark coughed, cheeks reddening. Julia was just making sure I was okay after my bump on the head." Sophie considered this, then nodded solemnly. "Good. Dad's not good at taking care of himself." Julia laughed, the sound bright and unguarded. "I'll keep an eye on him, I promise." Sophie grinned, instantly accepting her into their little world. She dragged Julia to the living room to show off her latest dinosaur drawing, chattering about school and friends and the upcoming science fair. Mark watched them, his heart full, realizing that this messy, imperfect, beautiful chaos was everything he'd ever wanted. The days that followed were a blur of new routines and tentative steps. Julia and Mark navigated the delicate balance of work and home, careful not to let their relationship spill into the office. But people noticed, the way Julia smiled more, the way Mark seemed lighter, the way they gravitated toward each other in every meeting. One evening, as they walked Sophie home from her piano lesson, Julia paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the sky streaked with the colors of sunset. "I used to think I had to do everything alone, that needing someone was weakness." Mark squeezed her hand. "You're the strongest person I know, but even the strongest people need someone to lean on." She looked at him, her eyes shining. "I want to lean on you, Mark. I want to build something together." He pulled her close, pressing his forehead to hers. "We already are." Sophie ran ahead, spinning in circles, her laughter echoing down the street. Julia watched her, feeling hope bloom in her chest, a hope she'd buried for years, afraid to let it grow. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Julia and Mark sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars appear one by one. Julia rested her head on Mark's shoulder, her hand entwined with his. "Do you ever think about the future?" she asked softly. "All the time," he replied, "but for the first time, I'm not afraid of it." She smiled, closing her eyes. "Me neither." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes when words are no longer necessary. The storm that had brought them together was long gone, but its memory lingered, a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected moments lead to the most beautiful beginnings. As the night deepened, Julia whispered, "Thank you for saving me." Mark kissed her hair, his voice a promise in the darkness. "You saved me too." And in that quiet, ordinary moment, they both knew they were home.